Sometimes the loneliest people are those who have everything the world says they should want. Sometimes the strongest hearts belong to those who've lost everything they thought they needed. In the harsh Wyoming territory of 1,880, Silas Crawford owned more land than most men could ride across in a week, but he'd never heard a child call him father. Down the valley, Margaret Hayes counted every penny and prayed each night her daughters wouldn't go hungry. When desperation brings these two souls together, an old rancher makes an offer that shocks even himself. He'll give her his entire ranch if she'll give him the one thing his fortune can't buy a son. What starts as a business arrangement in the unforgiving frontier becomes something neither expected. Can two people broken by life find healing in each other? What happens when a marriage of convenience becomes inconveniently real? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying grass across the endless expanse of the Crawford Ranch, where Silas stood on his porch, watching the sun bleed orange across the Wyoming sky. At 62, his weathered hands gripped the wooden rail with the same strength that had built this empire from nothing, but his grey eyes held a weariness that cattle prices and harsh winters had never put there. The silence stretched before him like the rolling hills, beautiful, vast, and utterly empty. Behind him, the great house echoed with the hollow sound of his footsteps. 23 rooms, each one furnished with the finest that money could buy from back east, each one as barren as a tomb. The mahogany dining table could seat 16, yet he ate alone every evening, his fork scraping against china in a rhythm that mocked the beating of his solitary heart. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the hours of a life measured not in joy or sorrow, but in the steady accumulation of wealth that would die with him. Silas had built this ranch from a homestead claim and sheer determination, driving cattle through blizzards that killed lesser men, fighting off rustlers and wolves with equal ferocity. He'd survived the harsh winters of 72 and 78 that broke half the ranchers in the territory. His herds now numbered in the thousands, his land stretched to 3 horizons, and his name commanded respect in every saloon and bank from Cheyenne to Denver. Yet, as he stood there, fingering the worn silver locket in his vest pocket, the only photograph of his beloved Sarah, taken just months before the fever claimed her, 23 years ago, he understood that all his success meant nothing without someone to inherit it. The locket had been his talisman, his reminder of what love felt like before grief hardened his heart like leather left too long in the sun. Sarah had died in the 2nd year of their marriage, taking with her not just his happiness, but his hope for the family that would have given meaning to everything he'd built. He'd thrown himself into work after that, driving himself and his men through seasons of plenty and want, always moving, always building, never stopping long enough to feel the ache of what was missing. 3 miles down the valley, in a cabin that would fit inside his kitchen, Margaret Hayes bent over her mending by the light of a single candle. Her fingers, once soft from a comfortable life in St. Louis, now bore the calluses of a woman who'd learned to split wood, tend chickens, and patch clothes until they held together more by will than thread. At 28, she possessed the kind of beauty that survived hardship, sharp cheekbones that had grown more defined with worry, dark hair that caught firelight like spun copper, and green eyes that still held flecks of hope despite everything the frontier had taken from her. "Mama, is Papa coming back?" 6-year-old Sarah named, for her grandmother peered around the corner of their one-bedroom, her nightgown hanging like a ghost's shroud on her thin frame. Margaret set down her needle and opened her arms, gathering the child close. "No, sweet pea, Papa's with the angels now, remember? But we're going to be just fine, you and Emma and me." 8-year-old Emma appeared beside her sister, her dark eyes too serious for her age. She'd been the one to find her father that terrible morning last spring, collapsed beside the plough where his heart had finally given out from years of trying to make this stubborn land profitable. The child had run the half-mile to the neighbor's place, her bare feet bleeding on the rocky ground, screaming for help that came too late. "Mrs. Henderson says the bankman was asking about us again," Emma said with the matter, a fact tone children used to deliver news that could destroy their world. Margaret's hand stilled in Sarah's hair. The foreclosure notice lay folded in her Bible, a final warning that gave her until the end of October, just 3 weeks away, to find $67 or lose everything. $67 might as well have been 67,000. The small crop of vegetables she'd managed to coax from their plot had brought in barely enough for flour and beans. The chickens provided eggs, but winter was coming, and without money for feed or firewood, they faced a choice between starvation and the poorhouse. "Don't you worry about that," Margaret whispered, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "We'll think of something." But as she tucked her daughters into the narrow bed, they shared, listening to their whispered prayers for their papa in heaven and enough food for tomorrow. Margaret felt the walls of their tiny cabin pressing in like a coffin. She'd already sold everything of value: her wedding china, her mother's jewelry, even the horse that might have given them a chance to escape to somewhere with better prospects. Pride had kept her from accepting charity, but pride wouldn't keep her children warm when the snow came. Outside, the wind rattled the loose boards on their roof, and Margaret pulled her shawl tighter as she returned to her mending. In the dancing candlelight, she studied the worn photograph of her husband that sat on the crude mantel. Thomas Hayes had been a dreamer, full of grand plans about making their fortune on the frontier. He'd possessed a gentle soul and tender hands, better suited for the schoolroom where he'd taught back in Missouri than for breaking this unforgiving land. But he'd loved her with a quiet devotion that made every hardship bearable, and when pneumonia weakened his heart beyond repair, she'd lost not just her husband, but her faith that love could conquer anything. The contrast between the Crawford ranch house and the Hayes cabin was more than a matter of money. It was the difference between a man who'd conquered the frontier and a family it had nearly destroyed. Yet both dwellings echoed with the same profound loneliness, the same ache for something that wealth couldn't buy and poverty couldn't steal. The simple human need for connection, for purpose, for someone to love who would love you in return. Neither Silas nor Margaret slept well that night. He paced the halls of his empty mansion, counting the rooms that would never hold children's laughter, while she lay awake, calculating and recalculating figures that never added up to salvation. Both were adrift in their separate sorrows, unaware that tomorrow would bring them face to face at Henderson's general store, where desperation would speak words that would scandalize the territory and change both their lives forever. The silver locket rested against Silas's chest as he finally drifted off in his massive 4-poster bed, while 3 miles away, Margaret clutched her daughters close in their narrow cot, neither knowing that fate was preparing an offer that would test every assumption they'd ever made about love, sacrifice, and what it truly means to build a family from the ashes of broken dreams. The morning air bit sharp as Margaret hitched their remaining horse to the wagon for the weekly trip to Henderson's general store. Emma and Sarah huddled together on the wooden seat, their breath forming small clouds in the October chill. Margaret had counted their remaining coins 3 times before leaving enough for flour and beans, nothing more. The bank notice crinkled in her coat pocket like a death sentence, but she'd promised herself she wouldn't think about it until after they'd gathered their meager supplies. Henderson's store occupied the heart of Clearwater's main street, its wooden boardwalk creaking under the boots of ranchers, farmers, and the occasional drifter. The familiar smells of coffee, leather, and tobacco greeted Margaret as she pushed through the door, the brass bell announcing their arrival. Mrs. Henderson looked up from behind the counter, her expression mixing sympathy with the careful distance respectable folks maintained around those touched by misfortune. "Morning, Margaret." "Girls." The older woman's voice carried genuine warmth despite her caution. "What can I help you with today?" "Just the usual supplies," Margaret replied, setting her small purse on the counter with hands that trembled slightly. She'd grown to hate that sound, the pitiful jingle of a few coins that represented her family's entire fortune. As Mrs. Henderson began gathering flour and beans, Margaret noticed the imposing figure of Silas Crawford examining harnesses near the back of the store. Even at 62, he commanded attention-broad shoulders that hadn't bowed to age, silver hair combed neat under his hat, and those penetrating grey eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. She'd seen him before, of course. Everyone knew the richest man in 3 counties, though their paths rarely crossed in any meaningful way. Mrs. Hayes, the bank clerk, Walter Finch, appeared at her elbow like a spectre. His thin face wore the apologetic expression of a man paid to deliver bad news. "I was hoping to catch you. Mr. Morrison wanted me to remind you about the payment schedule." Margaret's face flushed hot, aware that every conversation had stopped, every ear straining to hear her humiliation made public. "I'm well aware of my obligations, Mr. Finch." Of course. It's just that October 31st is 11 days away. Yes, I can count." Her voice cracked despite her efforts to maintain dignity. Emma pressed closer to her side, sensing the tension even if she didn't understand its full implications. "Mama," Sarah's small voice piped up, "why does the man look angry at you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Margaret felt the weight of every stare, heard the whispered conversations that would follow them home and spread through the valley like wildfire. The proud widow brought low, unable to pay her debts, soon to be cast out with her children to face winter with nothing. She was reaching for her purse, intending to pay for what little she could afford and flee this public shame, when a deep voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Finch." Silas Crawford's boots echoed across the wooden floor as he approached. "Your business with Mrs. Hayes can wait. This is hardly the place for such discussions." The clerk straightened, clearly intimidated by the rancher's presence. "Mr. Crawford, You were just leaving." The words weren't spoken loudly, but they carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Finch gathered his papers and scurried out with barely a goodbye. Margaret stood frozen, her cheeks burning with mortification. Bad enough to be publicly dunned for debts she couldn't pay, but to require rescue from the territory's most prominent citizen made it infinitely worse. "Mrs. Hayes." Silas removed his hat, revealing the full shock of silver hair that had once been black as coal. "I wonder if I might have a word with you. Outside, perhaps." "That's very kind, Mr. Crawford, but—" "Please." Something in his tone made her look up, and she saw not pity in his eyes, but something more complexer, mixture of determination and what almost looked like fear. "It's important." Against her better judgment, Margaret found herself following him onto the boardwalk, leaving her daughters with Mrs. Henderson. The autumn sun felt weak on her face as Silas turned to face her, his hat turning slowly in his weathered hands. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm going to say something that will sound peculiar. I ask that you hear me out before you respond." Margaret nodded, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Up close, she could see the lines that years of squinting into prairie sun had carved around his eyes, the way his jaw worked as if he were chewing difficult words. "I understand you're facing financial difficulties. Mr. Crawford, I appreciate your concern, but my affairs are— I have a proposition." The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been practicing them and finally found the courage to speak. "A business arrangement that would solve your immediate problems and address a need of my own." Margaret waited, sensing that whatever came next would change everything. Silas cleared his throat, his knuckles white where they gripped his hat brim. "I'm 60, 2 years old, Mrs. Hayes. I've built something substantial, but I have no heir. When I die, everything I've worked for will be sold off, divided among lawyers and distant relatives who never lifted a finger to earn it." He paused, studying her face. "You need security for your daughters. I need a son to inherit the Crawford name and legacy." The words hung between them like a physical presence. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as the full implication hit her. "I'm proposing marriage, Mrs. Hayes, a practical arrangement. You would live in comfort, your daughters would want for nothing, and in return—" his voice grew softer, almost vulnerable. "In return, you would give me a son." The boardwalk seemed to tilt beneath Margaret's feet. Through the store window, she could see her daughters watching anxiously, their small faces pressed against the glass like flowers seeking sunlight. The bank notice crinkled in her pocket, counting down the days to their destruction. "Mr. Crawford," she stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was suggesting. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." His grey eyes held hers steadily. "I know it sounds cold, calculated, but think about what I'm offering. Your daughters would grow up in the finest house in the territory. They'd have tutors, proper clothes, opportunities you could never provide alone. And you," he gestured toward the store where half the town was probably pressed against the windows, watching their conversation. "You'd never again face public humiliation over money you don't have. You're talking about a business transaction," Margaret whispered, though her voice carried enough edge to make several passers-by turn their heads. "Marriage isn't cattle to be bought and sold." "Isn't it?" Silas's smile held no humor. "Look around you, Mrs. Hayes. How many marriages in this territory began with love? Half the women here married for protection, for shelter, for someone to help them survive. At least I'm being honest about the terms." Margaret's mind raced. It was true that frontier marriages often began as practical arrangements, but to enter into wedlock specifically to produce an heir seemed almost medieval in its cold calculation. "I need time to think." "Of course." Silas placed his hat back on his head, the gesture somehow making him seem taller, more imposing. "But not too much time. I understand Finch wasn't exaggerating about your deadline." As he turned to leave, Margaret found her voice again. "Mr. Crawford, why me? Surely there are other women, younger women, who might be interested in such an arrangement." He paused, looking back over his shoulder. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been loneliness. "Because you understand loss, Mrs. Hayes. You know what it means to love something enough to sacrifice for it. That's the kind of woman I need, not some young girl looking for romance, but someone who understands that the most important things in life are worth fighting for, worth making hard choices for." With that, he walked away, leaving Margaret standing on the boardwalk with her world turned upside down. Through the window, Emma and Sarah watched her with wide, trusting eyes, believing their mother could solve any problem, fix any crisis. The weight of their faith pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. That evening, as Margaret tucked her daughters into bed in their tiny cabin, Sarah asked the question that had been haunting her all day. "Mama, what did the fancy man want?" Margaret smoothed the child's hair, buying time while her mind churned. "He wanted to discuss some business, sweet pea." "Good business?" Emma asked hopefully. "The kind that means we don't have to move away." Margaret looked at her daughter, beautiful, innocent daughters who deserved so much more than this hard-scrabble existence. Outside, the wind rattled their loose roof boards, reminding her that winter was coming whether she was ready or not. "I don't know yet," she whispered, though in her heart she was beginning to understand that Silas Crawford had offered her the only choice that made any sense at all. The question wasn't whether she could afford to accept his proposition. The question was whether she could afford not to. Margaret spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with Silas Crawford's proposition before she finally sought counsel from the one person whose wisdom she trusted above all others. Reverend Mitchell had baptized both her daughters and buried her husband. If anyone could help her navigate the moral complexities of what amounted to a marriage of pure convenience, it would be him. She found him in the small cemetery behind the white clapboard church, tending to the graves with the same gentle care he showed his parishioners. Thomas's headstone stood among the newer markers, its carved inscription already weathered by Wyoming's harsh climate. "Thomas Hayes, beloved husband and father, called home too soon." "Margaret." The Reverend straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "I was hoping you'd come by. Mrs. Henderson mentioned you seemed troubled after your encounter with Mr. Preston." "Crawford." Heat crept up Margaret's neck. Of course, the whole town was talking about their public conversation. "Reverend, I need guidance. I've been presented with—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound as scandalous as the truth. "An unusual opportunity." They sat together on the wooden bench Thomas had built for the church 2 summers before his death, when hope still outweighed hardship in their small family. Reverend Mitchell waited patiently while Margaret gathered the courage to speak the words aloud. Mr. Crawford has proposed marriage, she finally said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. A business arrangement. He needs an heir. I need security for my daughters. The older man's weathered face showed no judgment, only the kind of deep consideration that came from years of counseling souls in crisis. And how do you feel about this proposition? Horrified, tempted, desperate. Margaret twisted her wedding ring Thomas's ring around her finger, a gesture that had become unconscious over the months since his death. Is it wrong to consider marrying without love, to enter into holy matrimony, as if it were a cattle trade? Marriage has taken many forms throughout history, Reverend Mitchell said slowly. Abraham married Hagar to ensure his lineage. Ruth pledged herself to Boaz for security and protection. The Bible is full of unions born from necessity rather than romance. But this feels different, calculated, like I'd be selling myself, or like you'd be ensuring your daughters have a future. The Reverend's gentle eyes held no condemnation. Margaret, I knew your Thomas. He was a good man who loved you deeply. But he was also practical. If he were here today, what do you think he'd want for you and the girls? Margaret's throat tightened. She could almost hear Thomas's voice, see his patient smile as he worked through problems with the same methodical care he'd brought to his teaching. He'd want us safe, fed. He'd want Emma and Sarah to have opportunities he couldn't provide. Mr. Crawford is a hard man, but he's fair. His word is good throughout the territory. If he's offering protection and security, he'll honor that commitment. That evening, Margaret sat before Thomas's photograph after the girls had gone to sleep, having the conversation she'd been avoiding for days. Speaking to his image felt foolish, but she needed to say the words aloud, needed to ask for forgiveness or permission or understanding. I don't love him, Thomas. I don't even know if I can learn to love him, but our daughters. Her voice broke. They deserve better than watching their mother beg for credit at Henderson's store. They deserve warm clothes and full bellies and books to read. They deserve a future. The photograph stared back with Thomas's gentle eyes, offering no answers but no judgment either. Margaret pulled the wedding ring from her finger, holding it up to catch the firelight. The simple gold band had been all Thomas could afford when they'd married 9 years ago, but it had symbolized everything they'd built together: love, hope, partnership, dreams. Now those dreams lay buried with Thomas, and she faced a choice between honoring the past and securing the future. Slowly, reverently, she placed the ring in the small wooden box where she kept their marriage certificate and the few letters he'd written during their brief courtship. Someday, when Emma was old enough, she'd give her the ring and tell her about the father who'd loved them all enough to work himself to death trying to provide for them. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Margaret was hanging laundry behind the cabin when she heard horses approaching. Through the cottonwoods, she saw Silas Crawford riding alongside a man she recognized as Dr. Samuel Morrisonot, the banker, but the territory's only physician, recently arrived from Boston to serve the scattered communities. Mrs. Hayes. Silas dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. I apologize for the intrusion. I brought Dr. Morrison to examine you and the girls. Margaret's spine stiffened. I beg your pardon. Dr. Morrison, a slight man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, cleared his throat diplomatically. Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Crawford has explained the nature of his proposal. If you're considering such an arrangement, it would be prudent to ensure everyone's health is satisfactory. The clinical nature of it stung, even though Margaret understood the practical necessity. If she was to bear Silas an heir, he had every right to know she was capable of doing so safely. Mama? Emma appeared at her elbow, having heard the men's voices. Who are these men? Silas removed his hat, his stern features softening slightly as he looked down at the child. Good morning, Miss Emma. I'm Mr. Crawford. This is Dr. Morrison. We came to meet you and your sister properly. Emma studied him with the unblinking directness of children. You're the man who has the big house with all the windows. That's right. How would you like to see it sometime? Could Sarah come too? Of course. Something in Silas's voice suggested he was more nervous than he appeared. I was hoping both you girls might come visit soon. After Dr. Morrison's examination, which pronounced both Margaret and her daughters in excellent health, despite their recent hardships, Silas lingered while the physician rode back to town. Margaret found herself studying him as he stood awkwardly in her small parlour, his large frame making the cramped space seem even tinier. "Your daughters are lovely," he said, his hat turning in his hands again. "Well-mannered. Thomas was a good father." Yes, he was. Margaret kept her voice steady, though hearing her late husband's name from this man's lips felt strange. "I want you to know, Mrs. Hayes, that if you accept my proposal, I would never try to replace their father in their hearts, but I would do my best to provide the guidance and protection they need." It was the first time since making his shocking offer that Silas had spoken of anything beyond the practical arrangement they were negotiating. For a moment, Margaret glimpsed something beneath his gruff, exterior man, who understood loss, who recognized that some wounds never fully healed. "Mr. Crawford, if I were to consider your proposition, and I'm not saying I will, I would need certain assurances." His grey eyes sharpened with interest. "Name them." "My daughters would be treated as your own children, not as obligations you've inherited. They would receive the same education and opportunities as any son we might." She faltered, heat rushing to her cheeks at the implication of what she was discussing. "Agreed. What else?" "I would maintain authority over household matters and the children's upbringing. This may be a business arrangement, but I won't be treated as a hired woman in my own home." Silas nodded slowly. "You'll find I have no interest in domestic affairs, Mrs. Hayes. I've managed alone for 23 years. I'm perfectly content to leave such matters in capable hands." Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself for the most difficult condition. "And I would need time. Time to adjust to this new life. Time for you to court my trust and—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't speak aloud about the intimacy that would be required to fulfill her part of their bargain. "I'm not a young man driven by passion, Mrs. Hayes. I can be patient, within reason, but I won't pretend that producing an heir isn't the ultimate goal of this arrangement." The stark honesty of it made Margaret's cheeks burn, but she appreciated his directness. At least there would be no false pretenses, no romantic deception to complicate matters. As Silas prepared to leave, he paused at the door, his expression softer than she'd yet seen it. "Mrs. Hayes, I want you to know that this proposal doesn't come from coldness or mere calculation. I've watched you these past months, seen how you've cared for your daughters, despite your circumstances. You have strength and dignity that can't be bought. Those qualities, along with your children, would bring life to a house that's been empty too long." After he'd ridden away, Margaret sat in her tiny kitchen, staring at the foreclosure notice that would seal their fate in just 8 days. Thomas's ring lay in its box, a symbol of love freely given and joyfully received. But love was a luxury for those who had the security to choose it. For a widow with 2 children and winter approaching, survival had to come first. That night, as she tucked Emma and Sarah into bed, she made her decision. Tomorrow, she would ride to the Crawford ranch and accept Silas's proposition. Not for love, not for romance, but for the chance to give her daughters the life they deserved. If that made her calculating or mercenary, then so be it. Some sacrifices were worth making, even if they cost you everything you'd once believed about love and marriage and the choices a woman should make with her heart. Margaret's hands trembled as she hitched the horse to their wagon for what might be the last time. The morning air held the bite of coming winter, and frost had painted the grass silver in the shadow of their cabin. Emma and Sarah sat bundled in their worn coats, sensing the importance of this journey without understanding its full meaning. "Are we going to see the big house, Mama?" Sarah asked, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. "Yes, sweet pea. We're going to talk to Mr. Crawford about some changes that might be coming." The 3-mile ride to the Crawford ranch felt both endless and far too short. Margaret had rehearsed her acceptance speech a dozen times, but the words felt foreign on her tongue. How did one agree to marry for money and heirs? How did she explain to her daughters that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't possibly comprehend? The Crawford ranch house rose from the prairie like something from a fairy tale. 3 stories of white-painted wood and gleaming windows, with a wraparound porch that could hold their entire cabin. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys, promising warmth and comfort beyond anything Margaret's children had ever known. For a moment, she wondered if she was making the right choice or simply trading one form of captivity for another. Silas emerged before they'd even stopped the wagon, his silver hair combed neat and his Sunday clothes suggesting he'd been expecting them. Behind him came a woman Margaret didn't recognize, middle-aged, with graying brown hair and the capable air of someone accustomed to managing large households. Mrs. Hayes. Silas helped her down from the wagon with surprising gentleness. "Girls, welcome to the Crawford Ranch. This is Mrs. Chen, my housekeeper. She's been looking forward to meeting you." Mrs. Chen stepped forward with a warm smile that seemed genuine despite the unusual circumstances. "Mrs. Hayes, such a pleasure. Mr. Crawford has told me so much about you and your daughters. Would you girls like to see the house while your mother and Mr. Crawford talk business?" Emma and Sarah looked to Margaret for permission, their eyes wide with wonder at the prospect of exploring such a magnificent place. Margaret nodded, watching them disappear into the house with Mrs. Chen, their excited chatter fading as the great oak door closed behind them. "Shall we sit?" Silas gestured toward the porch chairs, but Margaret remained standing, needing to speak before her courage failed. "Mr. Crawford, I've considered your proposition." The words came out more formal than she'd intended, as if she were addressing a business meeting rather than discussing marriage. "I'm prepared to accept your terms with the conditions we discussed previously." Something flickered across Silas's weathered features, relief, perhaps, or satisfaction. He nodded slowly, his grey eyes studying her face. "I'm glad to hear it, Mrs. Hayes. I believe this arrangement will benefit us both. However," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength, "I need you to understand something. I'm not entering this marriage as a broken woman seeking rescue. I'm making a difficult choice to secure my daughter's future. I won't be grateful or subservient. I'll be a partner in this arrangement, nothing more and nothing less." For the first time since she'd known him, Silas Crawford smiled, not the polite expression he'd worn during their negotiations, but something warmer and more genuine. "Mrs. Hayes, I wouldn't have made this offer to a woman who needed rescuing. I need someone strong enough to be my equal, not my dependent." They discussed practical matters then, the wedding date, living arrangements, financial provisions for her daughters. Margaret would maintain a small account for personal expenses, Emma and Sarah would have their own rooms and a private tutor, and Mrs. Chen would help with the transition to managing such a large household. It was all very civilized, very reasonable, and completely devoid of anything resembling romance. "There's something else," Silas said as their business discussion wound down. "Something I'd like you to have." He disappeared into the house, returning moments later with something wrapped in soft cloth. When Margaret unwrapped it, she found a hand-carved wooden horse, no bigger than her palm, but exquisitely detailed. The wood had been polished to a warm honey color, and she could see where careful hands had shaped every muscle, every flowing line of the mane. "You made this?" "Last night. I thought the girls might like it." Silas's cheeks showed a faint flush of embarrassment. "I know it's not much compared to what they'll have here, but I wanted them to have something made specifically for them." Margaret turned the little horse over in her hands, surprised by the delicate craftsmanship. It spoke of patience, of careful attention to detail, of hands that could create beauty as well as build empires. For the first time since Silas had made his shocking proposal, she glimpsed the man beneath the reputation, someone who understood that children needed more than material comfort, that sometimes the smallest gestures carried the greatest meaning. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and meant it. Inside the house, Emma and Sarah's voices echoed through rooms that seemed designed for laughter and family gatherings. Mrs. Chen reappeared, beaming with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully entertained 2 young visitors. "They're delightful children," she told Margaret. "So well-behaved, so curious about everything. They'll be very happy here." "Mama!" Sarah came running, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "There's a piano, and a library with more books than I've ever seen, and Mrs. Chen says there might be kittens in the barn." Emma followed more sedately, but her eyes held the same wonder. "Mama, is it true we might live here?" Margaret knelt to her daughter's level, the wooden horse still warm in her palm. "Girls, I need to tell you something important. Mr. Crawford has asked me to marry him, and I've said yes." The silence that followed felt heavy with unasked questions. Emma, always the more serious child, studied Silas with thoughtful eyes. "Will you be our new papa?" Silas cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direct question. "I'll be your stepfather, Emma. I know I could never take your real father's place, but I hope we can be friends." "Will we still remember Papa?" Sarah asked, her small voice wavering. "Always," Margaret assured her, pulling both girls close. "Your Papa will always be in our hearts, no matter where we live or what changes come. Mr. Crawford understands that." Silas nodded gravely. "Your father was a good man, girls. I'd be honored if you'd tell me about him sometime." The simple acknowledgement seemed to ease something in both children. Emma straightened her shoulders with the dignity of a girl forced to grow up too quickly. "When would we move here?" "After the wedding," Margaret replied. "Which will be soon. Very soon." They spent another hour at the ranch, with Silas showing them the stables and the workshop where he'd carved the wooden horse. Margaret watched him with her daughters, noting how he spoke to them as individuals rather than simply children to be managed. He listened when Emma explained her father's teaching methods, nodded seriously when Sarah described her favorite bedtime stories. There was an awkwardness to his interactions, as if he were out of practice with family life, but his efforts seemed genuine. The ride home passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the girls' excited whispers about their future rooms and the possibility of learning to ride horses. Margaret let them chatter, her own mind occupied with the magnitude of what she'd just committed to. In less than 2 weeks, she would be Mrs. Silas Crawford, mistress of the largest ranch in 3 counties, stepmother to no one, and mother to a child not yet conceived. That evening, as she prepared their simple supper, Margaret was surprised by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Beth Henderson from the general store, accompanied by 2 other women from town, Alice Murphy, the doctor's wife, and Sarah Whitman, whose husband ran the livery stable. "Margaret, we came as soon as we heard," Beth said, pushing past her into the small parlor. "Is it true? Are you actually going to marry Silas Crawford?" The other women followed, their faces mixing concern with barely concealed curiosity. Margaret closed the door, steeling herself for the conversation she'd known would come eventually. "It's true," she said simply. "Oh, honey," Alice Murphy reached for her hand. "You don't have to do this. There are other Ways charity organizations back east, families who might take you in." "I'm not a charity case," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "This is my choice." "But to marry without love," Sarah Whitman's voice dropped to a scandalized whisper. "It's so cold, so calculated." "Is it?" Margaret faced the 3 women, her chin lifted defiantly. "Half the women in this territory married men they barely knew. How many of you married for love versus security, for passion versus protection?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable in its honesty. Beth Henderson had married her husband after knowing him for 3 weeks. Alice Murphy had wed Dr. Morrison through a mail-order arrangement. Only Sarah Whitman had enjoyed anything resembling a courtship, and even that had been driven more by practical considerations than romance. "That's different," Beth protested weakly. "How? Because I'm being honest about the arrangement, because I'm not pretending this is some grand love story." Margaret moved to the window, looking out at her daughters playing in the fading light. "My children need a future, and I need a way to provide it. Mr. Crawford needs an heir, and I can give him one. It's a fair exchange." "And what about you?" Alice asked gently. "What about your needs, your heart?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching Emma help Sarah climb their favorite cottonwood tree. "My heart belongs to Thomas. It always will. But my daughters belong to the living, and they deserve every opportunity I can give them. If that means marrying a man I respect but don't love, then that's what I'll do." The women left eventually, their concerns voiced but not resolved. Margaret knew the gossip would spread the desperate widow who'd sold herself for security, the cold arrangement that mocked the sanctity of marriage. Let them talk. She'd endured worse whispers and survived. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Margaret sat at her small table and wrote the most difficult letter of her life. It was addressed to her sister Catherine in St. Louis, explaining her decision and asking her to pray for wisdom rather than judgment. "I know this seems shocking," she wrote, "but I've found a way to secure Emma and Sarah's future. Mr. Crawford is a good man, if not a romantic one. He'll provide for us, protect us, and give the girls opportunities they could never have otherwise. I'm not marrying him for love, Catherine, but perhaps respect and shared purpose are enough foundation for a family. Thomas would understand. He always said a parent's first duty is to their children's welfare, and that's what I'm doing, ensuring my daughters have the chance at life Thomas would have wanted for them." She sealed the letter with wax, knowing it would be weeks before any reply could reach her. By then, she'd be Mrs. Crawford, living in the big house, sleeping in a stranger's bed, committed to bearing him the son he so desperately wanted. The wooden horse sat on her mantel beside Thomas's photograph, a symbol of the unexpected kindness she'd discovered in her stern benefactor. Perhaps their arrangement would grow into something warmer than mutual convenience. Perhaps she would find contentment, if not love, in her new life. Or perhaps she would spend her remaining years as a well-kept stranger in a beautiful house, playing the role of wife to a man whose heart remained as distant as the mountains on the horizon. Only time would tell which fate awaited her, but as Margaret prepared for bed in her small cabin for one of the last times, she felt a cautious hope stirring alongside her practical determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments, new lessons in living as someone she'd never planned to become. But for tonight, she'd made the choice that would secure her daughter's future, and that knowledge brought a peace she hadn't felt since Thomas died. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning in the small white church where Margaret had married Thomas 9 years earlier. She wore her mother's dress, carefully altered to fit her slender frame, and carried a simple bouquet of late-blooming prairie roses that Silas had picked himself from the wild patches near his property line. The gesture had surprised her, this practical man, taking time to gather flowers for a bride in a ceremony of pure convenience. Only a handful of people attended. Reverend Mitchell, Dr. Morrison as witness, Mrs. Chen, and the girls, who sat in the front pew wearing new dresses that Silas had commissioned from the seamstress in town. Emma clutched the wooden horse he'd carved, while Sarah swung her legs nervously, too young to fully understand why her mother looked so pale and serious. "Do you, Silas James Crawford, take Margaret Elizabeth Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" Margaret watched Silas's face as he spoke his vows, noting the firm set of his jaw and the way his grey eyes never wavered from hers. There was no tenderness in his expression, but there was certainty, the look of a man who understood the weight of his promises and intended to honor them. "I do. And do you, Margaret Elizabeth Hayes, take Silas James Crawford to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" The words stuck in her throat for a moment. This was it, the point of no return. After this, she would be bound to this man, committed to sharing his bed, bearing his children, spending whatever years remained to her as his wife rather than Thomas's widow. "I do." The simple gold band Silas slipped onto her finger felt foreign and heavy. It was wider than Thomas's ring had been, more substantial, with small engravings of wheat sheaves along the Banda farmer's wife's ring, he'd told her. Though she was now a rancher's bride, the symbolism wasn't lost on her. This marriage would be about fertility, about harvest, about the practical business of building a legacy. Their first kiss as husband and wife was brief and chaste, more handshake than expression of affection. Margaret felt nothing but the scratch of his moustache and the scent of bay rum cologne. Whatever passion this union might eventually hold remained buried beneath layers of practical arrangement and mutual wariness. The wedding breakfast at the Crawford Ranch felt surreal. Margaret sat at the head of the long dining table she'd only seen empty, with Emma and Sarah flanking her like small bodyguards and Silas at the far end, looking as uncomfortable as she felt. Mrs. Chen had prepared a feast that would have fed 20 people, and the abundance felt overwhelming after months of counting every grain of rice. "Mrs. Crawford," Mrs. Chen said, the title sounding strange to Margaret's ears, "would you like me to show you to your room? I've prepared the master suite." Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks. She'd known this moment would come, but the reality of sharing intimate space with this man hit her like a physical blow. "That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Chen, but perhaps I think it might be better if I had my own room. Initially, while we all adjust to these new arrangements." Silas looked up from his barely touched plate, his expression unreadable. "Of course. The blue room is quite comfortable. It adjoins the master suite, but has its own entrance. Will that be satisfactory?" The clinical way he discussed their sleeping arrangements made Margaret's stomach churn, but she nodded gratefully. At least, she'd have time to prepare herself for the more intimate aspects of their bargain. The afternoon brought a parade of well-wishers and curious neighbors, all eager to see how the territory's most eligible bachelor had finally been caught. Margaret endured their congratulations and barely concealed questions with as much grace as she could muster, playing the role of happy bride while counting the minutes until she could escape the scrutiny. "You've certainly done well for yourself," commented Mrs. Peterson, whose own husband barely managed to keep their small farm profitable. From widow's weeds to the finest house in 3 counties, quite a step up. The comment stung, though Margaret kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Crawford and I found we have compatible goals for the future." "Oh yes, I'm sure you do." The woman's smile held a sharp edge. "Children do need security, after all." By evening, Margaret felt wrung out from playing hostess to people she barely knew, accepting congratulations on a marriage that felt more like a business merger than a union of hearts. When the last guest departed, she found herself alone with Silas in the grand parlor, the silence stretching between them like an unbridgeable chasm. "The girls seem to be settling in well," Silas offered, clearly searching for safe conversational ground. "They're resilient." Margaret smoothed her skirts, avoiding his gaze. "Children adapt more easily than adults." "Margaret." His use of her first name made her look up. "I want you to know that I don't expect. That is, I understand this arrangement will take time for all of us to adjust to. There's no pressure for anything beyond what you're comfortable with." The kindness in his voice surprised her. This gruff man who'd negotiated their marriage like a cattle deal was offering her the consideration she desperately needed but hadn't dared ask for. "Thank you," she whispered. "I appreciate your patience." That night, Margaret lay in the blue room's enormous bed, staring up at a ceiling higher than her entire previous bedroom. The sheets were fine linen, the mattress softer than anything she'd ever slept on, but comfort felt elusive. Through the adjoining door, she could hear Silas moving about his room, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of clothing, the sound of water being poured for washing. Her husband. The word felt impossible in her mind. Thomas had been her husband, her partner, her love. This man was what? Her provider, her protector, the father of children not yet conceived. A soft knock at her door made her sit up abruptly. "Yes? Mama?" Emma's voice was small and uncertain. "Sarah's crying. She wants to sleep with you, but Mrs. Chen said we shouldn't bother you on your wedding night." Margaret wrapped a robe around her nightgown and opened the door to find both her daughters in their new night clothes, Emma holding Sarah's hand protectively. The younger girl's face was streaked with tears, her small body trembling with homesickness for their familiar cabin. "Oh, sweet pea, come here." Margaret gathered them both into her arms, their warm weight a comfort in this strange new place. "You can stay with me tonight. This is all new for everyone." "I miss our old bed," Sarah whispered against Margaret's shoulder. "I miss Papa's picture on the wall." "I know, darling. I miss those things too. But Papa's picture is in the parlor now, and our old bed, well, you have beautiful new beds of your own now. Sometimes changes are hard, even when they're good changes." As she settled both girls in the large bed, Margaret caught a glimpse of movement through the partially open adjoining door. Silas stood in his doorway, watching the domestic scene with an expression she couldn't quite read. When their eyes met, he didn't retreat but instead stepped forward. "Is everything all right?" "Just some first-night nerves," Margaret replied, smoothing Sarah's hair. "They'll be fine." "Perhaps." He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Perhaps tomorrow I could show them the barn cats Mrs. Chen mentioned. And there's a gentle mare that might be suitable for riding lessons, if they're interested." Emma perked up at the mention of horses. "Really? We could learn to ride?" "Every ranch child should know how to handle horses," Silas said, his stern features softening slightly. "Your father would have wanted you to learn, I think." It was the second time he'd invoked Thomas's memory respectfully, and Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Whatever else this arrangement might be, Silas seemed to understand that honoring her late husband was important to all of them. As her daughters finally drifted off to sleep between them, Margaret lay awake contemplating the strange turn her life had taken. Less than 24 hours ago, she'd been Margaret Hayes, struggling widow. Now she was Margaret Crawford, wife to one of the territory's most powerful men, mistress of a house that could hold 6 families, mother to children who would want for nothing. The transformation should have felt triumphant, but instead it felt hollow-like, putting on clothes that belonged to someone else. She was playing a role she'd never auditioned for, in a life she'd never chosen. But as Sarah's small hand found hers in sleep and Emma's steady breathing filled the quiet room, Margaret reminded herself why she'd made this choice. Love might be absent from this marriage, but love for her daughters had made it possible. If that love could sustain her through the challenges ahead, through the intimate demands of their arrangement, through the gossip and judgment of their community, through the gradual building of a family from the fragments of broken dreams, then perhaps it would be enough. Tomorrow would bring new lessons in being Mrs. Crawford. Tonight, she was still herself a mother, protecting her children, a widow learning to hope again, a woman discovering that sometimes the most practical choices required the greatest courage of all. 3 weeks into her marriage, Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Silas teach Emma to curry the gentle mare he'd promised. The child's face glowed with concentration as she followed his patient instructions, her small hands learning to work the brush in long, smooth strokes along the horse's flank. Sarah sat perched on a fence rail, chattering excitedly about when it would be her turn to learn. Mrs. Chen bustled around the kitchen behind Margaret, preparing the evening meal with the efficiency of someone who'd managed this household long before a new mistress arrived. The older woman had been tactful about the transition, offering guidance without overstepping, but Margaret still felt like an imposter in her own kitchen. "He's good with them," Mrs. Chen observed, following Margaret's gaze to the barn. "Surprised me. Honestly, never seen him take to children before." Margaret nodded, though she wasn't entirely surprised. She'd begun to recognize that Silas's gruff exterior concealed depths he rarely revealed. The wooden horse had been only the first hint. In the past weeks, she'd discovered small kindnesses. A rocking chair that appeared in Emma's room after he noticed her reading by the window. Extra blankets placed in Sarah's room after a particularly cold night, books on teaching methods left on the library table after Margaret mentioned missing Thomas's profession. "Mrs. Crawford?" Mrs. Chen's voice held a gentle question. "Is everything all right? You seem pensive today." Margaret turned from the window, forcing a smile. The title still sounded foreign, but she was growing accustomed to it. "Just thinking, this is all still quite an adjustment." Mrs. Chen dried her hands on her apron, her expression thoughtful. "If you don't mind my saying, ma'am, adjustment goes both ways. Mr. Crawford's been alone in this house for over 20 years. Having a family again, well, It's changing him too. That evening, after the girls were settled in their rooms, Margaret found herself in the parlor with Silas, sharing the companionable silence that had become their routine. He read his agricultural journals while she worked on embroidery, both of them aware of each other's presence without the need for constant conversation. Margaret, his voice made her look up from her needlework. I've been thinking about Christmas. The holiday was still 6 weeks away, but she appreciated his consideration. What about it? The girls should have a proper Christmas. Tree, presents, maybe some of the neighbors over for dinner. I know this year has been difficult. I'd like to make it special for them. Margaret set down her embroidery, touched by his thoughtfulness. That's very kind, Silas. They would love that. She paused, studying his weathered features in the lamplight. What did you usually do for Christmas? Nothing much. Mrs. Chen would cook a good meal, and I'd give the hands extra pay. Not much call for celebration when you're alone. The simple statement revealed more loneliness than she'd expected, and Margaret felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. Well, you won't be alone this year. Their eyes met across the space between their chairs, and for a moment, something passed between them, not love, perhaps, but recognition of their shared commitment to building something meaningful from their practical arrangement. The moment was interrupted by Sarah's cry from upstairs, followed by the sound of running feet. Emma appeared in the doorway, her face pale with worry. Mama, Sarah's sick. She's burning up and says her throat hurts. Margaret was on her feet immediately, Silas close behind her. They found Sarah curled in her bed, her small face flushed with fever and her breathing labored. Margaret's heart clenched with familiar fear. She'd lost too much already to face the possibility of losing one of her daughters. I'll ride for Dr. Morrison, Silas said, already moving toward the door. In this weather? The storm? Margaret. His hand touched her shoulder briefly, a rare gesture of comfort. I'll get the doctor. Stay with her. The next several hours blurred together in a haze of cool cloths, whispered prayers, and desperate hope. Dr. Morrison arrived despite the howling wind and driving snow, his examination confirming Margaret's fears. Sarah had developed a severe case of croup, complicated by fever and difficulty breathing. Keep her upright, the doctor instructed, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. Steam from hot water will help. And someone needs to watch her through the night. If her breathing gets worse, you'll need to act quickly. Margaret settled into the chair beside Sarah's bed, determined not to leave her daughter's side. Silas appeared with extra blankets and a pot of steaming water, his usual commanding presence subdued by concern for the small girl who'd begun to feel like his own child. I can take a shift, he offered quietly. You should rest. I'm not leaving her. I didn't expect you to, but you can't help her if you collapse from exhaustion. As the night wore on, Silas proved to be an unexpected ally in the battle for Sarah's health. He kept the fire burning, brought fresh hot water for steam, and even convinced Emma to get some sleep by promising to wake her if there was any change. Near dawn, when Sarah's fever finally broke and her breathing eased, Margaret found tears streaming down her cheeks. She's going to be all right, Silas said softly, his own relief evident in his voice. Margaret looked up at him through her tears, seeing not the stern businessman who'd proposed their arrangement, but a man who genuinely cared about her child's welfare. Thank you for everything tonight, for getting the doctor, for staying, for... She's my daughter now too, he said simply, and the words hit Margaret with unexpected force. In the days that followed Sarah's recovery, something shifted in their household dynamic. The crisis had stripped away some of the formality between Margaret and Silas, revealing the foundation of genuine partnership that was growing beneath their practical arrangement. She found herself seeking his opinion on household matters, while he began sharing details about ranch business that affected their family's future. The winter's been harder than expected, he told her one evening as they sat by the fire. Lost some cattle in the blizzards, but spring will bring new opportunities. I'm thinking of expanding the horse breeding operation. Margaret looked up from the family Bible she'd been reading, noting how naturally he'd said "our" when referring to the ranch's future. Would that be profitable? More than cattle, with less risk, and the girls could be involved as they get older. Emma, especially, has a natural way with horses. The casual inclusion of her daughters in his long-term planning touched Margaret deeply. This marriage might have begun as a business transaction, but Silas was treating it as a true partnership, considering not just his own legacy, but the welfare of the family they were building together. Later that night, as Margaret prepared for bed in her separate room, she found herself thinking about the changes in their relationship. The awkwardness of their early days had given way to something warmer, not love, exactly, but affection and respect that grew stronger with each shared experience. She was brushing her hair when a soft knock came at her door. Opening it, she found Silas standing in the hallway, his expression uncertain. "Margaret, I wanted to talk to you about something." She invited him into her sitting area, noting how his presence filled the space without overwhelming it. Over the weeks, she'd grown comfortable with his quiet strength, the way he approached problems with methodical consideration rather than rash emotion. "I know our arrangement has been clinical," he began, his hands turning his hat in that familiar gesture of nervousness, "and I've tried to be patient, to give you time to adjust. But I want you to know that when you're ready, when you feel comfortable, I'd like our marriage to become more than just a legal convenience." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd known this conversation would come eventually, but hearing the words aloud made her stomach flutter with nervousness and something else she couldn't quite name. "I care about you, Margaret, about the girls. This has become more than the business arrangement I originally proposed. I won't pressure you, but I wanted you to know that my feelings have evolved." The honesty in his voice moved her more than flowery declarations might have. This was Silas's way, direct, genuine, without artifice or manipulation. She studied his weathered face, seeing the vulnerability he rarely showed, the hope he was afraid to voice too strongly. "I care about you too," she said softly, and realized she meant it. "More than I expected to when this all began. You've been kind to my daughters, patient with me, honorable in keeping your promises. That means more than you might realize." But he heard the hesitation in her voice. "But I need a little more time. Not much longer, I promise. I need to be sure I'm ready to be a true wife to you, not just going through the motions because it's expected." Silas nodded, though she could see the disappointment he was trying to hide. "I understand. Take whatever time you need, Margaret. We've waited this long. We can wait a little longer." After he left, Margaret sat in her chair by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that had become her new world. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman she was still learning to recognize, Margaret Crawford, rancher's wife, mother to 3 children instead of 2, partner in an enterprise that was growing into something neither she nor Silas had originally envisioned. The wooden horse sat on her dresser beside the family Bible, a reminder of the unexpected gentleness she'd discovered in her practical husband. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to deepen the partnership they were building. But tonight, for the first time since accepting Silas's proposal, Margaret felt genuinely hopeful about the future they were creating together, not just for his legacy or her daughter's security, but for the genuine affection that was growing between 2 people who'd found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. Margaret was organizing the library when she found the letter. It had fallen behind one of the heavy volumes on agricultural practices, and she might never have discovered it if she hadn't been determined to dust every surface in her new home. The envelope was addressed in a woman's flowing handwriting to "My dearest Silas," and the return address bore a St. Louis postmark from 15 years prior. Her first instinct was to put it back, where she'd found it a wife had no business reading her husband's private correspondence, especially letters that predated their marriage. But something about the envelope nagged at her, perhaps the careful way the woman had written Silas's name, or the fact that it had been preserved among his most valued books. Margaret stood in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through the library windows, the letter trembling in her hands as her conscience warred with curiosity. Outside, she could hear Emma and Sarah playing in the garden with the new puppy Silas had surprised them with last week. Their laughter reminded her of how completely their lives had changed, how much she'd come to depend on the security and growing affection her marriage provided. Finally, telling herself she needed to understand the man she'd married, Margaret carefully opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated March 15, 1868, written in the same elegant hand as the address. "My dearest Silas," it began, "I write to you with the heaviest of hearts to tell you that our precious boy passed peacefully in his sleep 3 nights ago. Little James fought so bravely against the fever, but his small body could not overcome the illness that has taken so many children this terrible winter." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. A son? Silas had had a son? "I know you wanted to return from the cattle drive when you received word of his illness, but Dr. Patterson assured me there was nothing you could have done. The sickness came so quickly, and he was so very small, only 8 months old, but already showing signs of your stubborn determination and my love of music. He would reach for the wooden rattle you carved for him and shake it with such purpose as if he were conducting an orchestra." The letter continued, describing the child's brief life and tragic death, but Margaret found herself unable to focus on the words. Her mind reeled with the implications of what she'd discovered. Silas had been married before, that much she'd known from Mrs. Chen's careful references to the first Mrs. Crawford. But he'd also been a father, had held his own child, had experienced the devastating loss of an infant son. "I cannot bear to remain in this house where every room echoes with his laughter," the letter continued. "By the time you receive this, I will have returned to my family in Boston. I know you will think me weak for leaving, but I cannot face the empty nursery, cannot endure the sight of the cradle you built with such hope and love. Perhaps someday I will be strong enough to try again, but not now, not here, surrounded by memories that cut like knives." The letter was signed, "Your devoted wife, Catherine," and included a postscript that made Margaret's heart ache. "I have left James's things in the nursery. I know you will want to decide what to do with them yourself. The wooden horse you carved for him is on the windowsill. He loved to hold it while he slept." Margaret sank into Silas's reading chair, the full weight of her discovery settling over her like a shroud. No wonder he'd been so desperate for an heir. No wonder the thought of dying without a son had driven him to make such an unusual proposal. He wasn't just seeking to continue his bloodline, he was trying to heal a wound that had never properly closed. The wooden horse. She thought of the delicate carving he'd made for her daughters, the patient way he'd shaped every detail. He'd done the same thing for his own son, had watched that baby hold the toy while drifting off to sleep, had probably dreamed of the day he could teach the boy to ride real horses. "Mama?" Emma's voice from the doorway made Margaret quickly fold the letter. "Mrs. Chen says supper will be ready soon. Are you coming?" "In just a moment, sweetheart." Margaret's voice sounded strained to her own ears. "Is Mr. Crawford back from town yet?" "He's in the barn with Sarah. She's trying to convince him to let the puppy sleep in her room." After Emma left, Margaret sat alone with the devastating knowledge of her husband's secret grief. Everything about their arrangement made terrible sense. His initial coldness, his careful emotional distance, his desperate need for a son to replace the one he'd lost. She wasn't just a convenient womb for his legacy. She was his second chance at the family that had been torn away from him. But why hadn't he told her? Why allow her to believe she was entering into a purely business arrangement when the truth was so much more complex and heartbreaking? That evening at supper, Margaret found herself studying Silas with new eyes. She noticed how his gaze lingered on Sarah when the child laughed, how he listened with careful attention when Emma described her lessons. Was he seeing his lost son in every interaction with her daughters? Was their growing family helping to heal the wounds left by that terrible loss? "You're quiet tonight," Silas observed after the girls had gone upstairs to play. "Is everything all right?" Margaret set down her coffee cup, her hands not quite steady. "Silas, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." Something in her tone made him straighten, his grey eyes sharpening with attention. "Of course. Were you married before? Before Sarah died?" His face went completely still, and for a moment Margaret thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "What brought this on?" "Mrs. Chen mentioned something about a first Mrs. Crawford, but when I asked, she said it wasn't her place to discuss your private affairs. If we're going to be truly married, I think I should know about your past." Silas was quiet for so long that Margaret began to wonder if she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. Finally, he pushed back from the table and walked to the window, his broad shoulders tense with some internal struggle. "Yes," he said without turning around, "I was married to Catherine Whitmore for 3 years. She left after we lost our son." "Oh, Silas." Margaret's heart clenched with sympathy. "I'm so sorry. How old was he?" 8 months. The words came out flat, emotionless, as if he'd learned to speak them without feeling. "Fever took him. Catherine she needed to go home to her family." "I understood." Margaret rose and crossed to where he stood, close enough to see the rigid set of his jaw. "Is that why you proposed our arrangement? Because you'd lost a son before?" He turned then, and the raw pain in his eyes made her breath catch. "Partly. I know it changes things, knowing that you're not my first choice for a wife, that I'm asking you to replace something I lost long ago." "Stop." Margaret's hand touched his arm, surprising them both. "That's not what I meant. I wish you'd told me. I wish I'd understood that this arrangement means more to you than just continuing your bloodline." "Does it matter?" His voice held a bitter edge. "The terms of our agreement remain the same. It matters because it means you're not the cold, calculating man I thought I was marrying. It means you understand loss and heartbreak and the desperate measures people take to protect what they love." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she found the words she needed. "It means we have more in common than I realized." Silas stared at her, clearly not expecting this response. "You're not angry? Hurt that I didn't tell you about James?" "I'm hurt that you felt you couldn't tell me," Margaret admitted. "But angry? No. Silas, I married you to save my daughters from poverty and uncertainty. You married me to honor the memory of a son you couldn't save. We're both trying to build something good from the wreckage of our losses." For the first time since she'd known him, Silas's carefully maintained composure cracked. His shoulders sagged slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried 20 years of buried grief. "I built a nursery for him, carved every piece of furniture with my own Hansa cradle, a rocking horse, toy soldiers. Catherine couldn't bear to see any of it after he died, so I closed off the room. It's been locked ever since." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. "Where is it?" "3rd floor, east wing, the room with the blue door." He paused, studying her face. Would you like to see it?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Margaret understood that if she agreed, she would be crossing a threshold in their relationship, moving from practical arrangement towards something deeper and more complex. "Yes," she said softly, "I would." They climbed the stairs in silence, past the 2nd floor, where her daughters slept peacefully, up to the 3rd floor she'd never fully explored. The east wing corridor stretched before them, lined with closed doors and dust motes dancing in the fading daylight. Silas stopped before a door painted soft blue, his hand resting on the brass knob. "I haven't opened this door in 15 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have to." "No." His grip tightened on the knob. "If we're going to be truly married, as you said, then you should know all of it." The door opened with a creak of protest, revealing a room frozen in time. Dust sheets covered most of the furniture, but Margaret could make out the shapes beneath a rocking chair, a small chest of drawers, and in the center of the room, a beautiful hand-carved cradle. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, illuminating the careful craftsmanship that spoke of a father's love and hope. Margaret moved slowly into the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. On the windowsill sat a small wooden horse, its honey-colored surface dulled by years of dust, but still beautiful in its simplicity. This was the model for the horse he'd carved for her daughters. "He loved that horse," Silas said from the doorway, seemingly unable to enter the room himself. "Catherine said he'd hold it while he slept, shake it when he was happy. I thought I could make him a whole herd of wooden animals as he grew older, teach him to carve his own toys. Margaret lifted the horse carefully, feeling the weight of dreams and loss in its smooth curves. What was he like? Strong. Even as a baby, he had this determined grippance. He grabbed onto something he wouldn't let go, and curious about everything. Catherine said he got that from me, always wanting to understand how things worked. A ghost of a smile crossed Silas's weathered features. He had her musical ear, though, would get quiet and attentive whenever she sang to him. He sounds wonderful. He was. Silas finally stepped into the room, moving to the covered cradle. I used to stand here at night, watching him sleep, making plans for his future. The ranch he'd inherit, the horses he'd learn to ride, the lessons I'd teach him about the land and the cattle, and what it means to build something lasting. Margaret understood now why Silas had been so specific about wanting a son. It wasn't just about inheritance or masculine pride, it was about completing a conversation that had been cut short, fulfilling dreams that had been interrupted by tragedy. "Silas," she said gently, "if we have a son when we have a son, he won't be a replacement for James. He'll be his own person, with his own personality and interests." "I know that." But his voice held uncertainty, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Do you? Because I need to know that any child we have together will be loved for himself, not as a second chance to recreate what you lost." The question forced Silas to confront something he'd perhaps been avoiding. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving around the preserved nursery with its burden of frozen hopes. "When Catherine left," he said finally, "she told me I was trying to hold on to something that was already gone. Maybe she was right. Maybe I have been living in the past, trying to rebuild what was taken from me instead of accepting what is." Margaret set the wooden horse back on the windowsill, then crossed to where Silas stood beside the cradle. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. "The past doesn't have to be your enemy," she said. "James was real, and your love for him was real. That doesn't diminish what we're building together. It's part of what brought us here." Silas looked down at their joined hands with wonder, as if he'd forgotten what such simple comfort felt like. "I never expected this," he said quietly. "What?" "To care about you the way I do. To want this marriage to be more than just an arrangement." His grey eyes met hers with startling intensity. "I'm falling in love with you, Margaret. Not because you can give me the son I lost, but because of who you are, your strength, your grace, the way you've made this house feel like a home again." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, not because they were unwelcome, but because they demanded a response she wasn't sure she was ready to give. She cared for Silas deeply, respected him, felt affection that grew stronger each day. But love, the consuming, transformative love she'd shared with Thomas? "I'm not there yet," she said honestly, "but I'm closer than I was a month ago. What you've shown me tonight, your trust, your vulnerability, it means everything to me." Silas nodded, though she could see the disappointment he was trying to hide. "I understand. I just wanted you to know where I stand, what this marriage has become for me." As they prepared to leave the nursery, Margaret paused at the threshold. "Silas, I think we should turn this into a proper nursery again. Not a shrine to the past, but a place for the future we're building together. You want to change it? I want to honor it. Keep the beautiful things you made, but add new pieces for new dreams. Make it a place where James's memory lives alongside the hope for the children we'll have together." For the second time that evening, Silas's composure nearly broke. "You would do that? Include James in our family's story? He's part of your story, which makes him part of mine. If we're going to move forward together, we take all of our history with us, the joy and the sorrow, the love and the loss." That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she felt the full weight of what she'd learned. Her marriage was far more complex than she'd originally understood, built on layers of grief and hope that would take time to fully explore. But for the first time since accepting Silas's proposal, she felt like she was entering into a partnership with the whole man, not just the carefully controlled facade he showed the world. The wooden horse sat on her dresser now, relocated from the dusty nursery to her private space. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate work of helping Silas transform his shrine to the past into a sanctuary for the future. And perhaps, in the process of creating space for new life, they would both learn to let their growing love fill the empty places that loss had carved in their hearts. Winter settled over the Crawford ranch with an intensity that reminded everyone why the frontier demanded such sacrifice from those who dared to call it home. By January, the snow lay 3 feet deep across the pastures, and the wind carved drifts against the barn that reached nearly to the eaves. But inside the great house, warmth and purpose filled every room as Margaret and Silas worked together to prepare for the spring that would bring new life to their growing family. Margaret's pregnancy had been confirmed by Dr. Morrison just after Christmas, and the news had transformed Silas in ways both touching and concerning. His joy was unmistakable. She'd found him more than once, standing in the renovated nursery, running his weathered hands over the cradle he'd carefully restored, his eyes bright with barely contained emotion. But alongside the happiness, Margaret sensed an undercurrent of anxiety that seemed to grow stronger with each passing week. "He's afraid," Mrs. Chen confided one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen, preparing preserves from the apples Silas had stored in the root cellar. "After what happened with little James, he's terrified of losing another child." Margaret paused in her peeling, considering the older woman's words. She'd noticed Silas's increased protectiveness, the way he insisted on accompanying her to town, his suggestions that she avoid lifting anything heavier than a teacup, his nervous hovering whenever she felt the slightest discomfort. "He barely lets me walk across the room without asking if I need assistance," Margaret said, with gentle exasperation. "Yesterday he wanted to carry me upstairs after I mentioned feeling tired." Can you blame him? The man watched Fever take his first son, then spent 15 years convinced he'd never have another chance at fatherhood. Now that chance is growing inside you, and he's scared senseless he'll lose it again. That evening, Margaret found Silas in his study, bent over papers that she realized were architectural drawings. As she drew closer, she saw they were plans for expanding the children's wing of the house, additional bedrooms, a larger playroom, even a small schoolroom. "Planning ahead?" she asked, settling carefully into the chair beside his desk. Silas looked up, his expression sheepish. "I know it's early to be making such plans, but I thought, I hoped we might have more than one child together. The girls will need more space as they grow, and if we're blessed with a large family—" "Silas." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "You're building castles before we've even laid the foundation. We don't know yet if this pregnancy will progress normally. It's too early to make such elaborate plans." The words were meant to be practical, but she saw immediately that they'd struck him like a physical blow. His face went pale, and the papers crumpled slightly under his clenched fists. "You think something might go wrong?" "I think we should take things one day at a time," Margaret replied carefully. "Focus on staying healthy and letting the baby develop naturally. All the planning in the world won't guarantee a safe delivery." But even as she spoke, Margaret realized her own fears were growing alongside Silas's. At 28, she was older than she'd been when carrying Emma and Sarah. The frontier offered limited medical care, and Dr. Morrison, while competent, lacked the resources of the big city hospitals. If complications arose during labor, their options would be severely limited. The fear crystallized one February morning when Margaret woke to cramping and spotting that sent Silas into a panic. Despite the blizzard raging outside, he rode through chest-deep snow to fetch Dr. Morrison, arriving back at the house with both the doctor and frostbite on his cheeks. "Bed rest," Dr. Morrison pronounced after his examination. "Complete bed rest for at least 2 weeks. The bleeding has stopped, but we can't take any chances." Margaret chafed at the confinement, but Silas enforced the doctor's orders with military precision. He moved his own work to the room adjoining hers, conducting ranch business from a makeshift desk so he could monitor her condition throughout the day. Emma and Sarah were allowed brief visits, but mostly Margaret found herself alone with her fears and the growing weight of everyone's expectations. "What if I lose this baby?" she asked Silas one evening as he sat beside her bed, reading aloud from one of his agricultural journals. The mundane discussions of crop rotation and cattle breeding had become oddly comforting during the long days of enforced rest. His reading stopped abruptly, and she saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped the journal. "Don't say that." "But what if I do? Silas, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this pregnancy might not—" "No." His voice was sharp, more forceful than she'd ever heard it. "I won't prepare for failure. I can't go through that again, Margaret. I can't lose another child." The raw pain in his voice made her heart ache. She reached for his hand, noting how it trembled slightly beneath her touch. "Silas, listen to me. If something happens to this baby, it won't be anyone's fault. Sometimes these things just— It would be my fault." The words came out in a whisper, but they carried the weight of years of self-recrimination. "I should have been here when James got sick. I should have come back from the cattle drive as soon as Catherine sent word. Maybe if I'd been here—" "Stop." Margaret's voice was firm despite her prone position. "James died of fever, not neglect. You were working to provide for your family, just like thousands of other men. You can't carry guilt for circumstances beyond your control." "Can't I? Because I've been carrying it for 15 years, and it's gotten heavier, not lighter." Margaret studied her husband's weathered face, seeing the torment he'd kept hidden beneath his practical exterior. "Is that why you proposed our arrangement? Not just for an heir, but for a chance to prove you could protect a child this time?" Silas was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice held the weight of long-buried truths. "Maybe. I told myself it was about legacy, about having someone to inherit the ranch. But maybe it was really about redemption, about proving I could be the father James never got to know." "Oh, Silas." Margaret squeezed his hand tighter. "You can't resurrect the dead by creating new life. This baby, if God blesses us with a healthy birth, will be its own person, not a second chance to save James." "I know that. Intellectually I know that, but emotionally—" He shook his head, unable to finish the thought. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Chen's arrival with the evening meal, but it left Margaret deeply troubled. She'd entered this marriage understanding Silas's desire for an heir, but she was beginning to realize the psychological weight he was placing on their unborn child. No baby should have to carry the burden of healing its father's grief or proving his worth as a protector. As February gave way to March and her condition stabilized, Margaret was finally allowed out of bed for short periods. She used the freedom to make her own preparations, but hers were more practical than Silas's grandiose expansion plans. She worked with Mrs. Chen to ensure the house would run smoothly during her confinement, arranged for additional help with Emma and Sarah's lessons, and quietly wrote letters to her sister Catherine, asking for prayers and preparing for the possibility that she might not survive the birth. It was during one of these letter-writing sessions that she discovered Silas standing in the nursery doorway, holding the handmade cradle he'd been working on for weeks. The original cradle, James's cradle, sat in the corner, carefully preserved, but no longer the room's focal point. This new one was larger, more elaborate, crafted with the desperate precision of a man trying to control fate through sheer force of will. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, though something about his intensity worried her. "I've been thinking about names," Silas said, running his hand along the cradle's smooth rail. "For a boy, I thought perhaps Thomas James, honoring both your late husband and my son. For a girl, maybe Sarah Catherine, after my first wife and your daughter." The names were thoughtful, generous even, but Margaret heard the underlying assumption that this child would be the culmination of all their losses and hopes. "Silas, we need to talk about expectations." "What do you mean?" "I mean that this baby, whether it's a boy or girl, is going to be itself not a memorial to the people we've lost, not a guarantee against future sorrow. Just a child who deserves to be loved for who it is, not who we need it to be. Silas set down the cradle with exaggerated care, his expression troubled. Are you saying I won't love our child properly? I'm saying that love and need aren't the same thing. You need this baby to heal your grief over James, to prove you can be a successful father, to fulfill our original arrangement. But those needs might overshadow the simple love. A child requires unconditional acceptance, not performance pressure. The conversation hung between them like a challenge. Outside, the March wind howled around the house, carrying the promise of spring, but also the reminder that winter's grip had not yet loosened. Margaret felt the baby move inside Hera, flutter of life that was both hope and responsibility. In just a few months, this child would arrive, bringing with it all the joy and terror that new life promised. Whether they were ready or not, whether their marriage had evolved enough to support the weight of such momentous change, whether Silas could learn to love without desperate needle, of these questions would soon be answered. For now, Margaret could only prepare as best she could, and pray that when the time came, they would both find the strength to welcome their child, not as the solution to old wounds, but as the beginning of new blessings. The contractions began just before dawn, on an April morning, when the wind screamed across the prairie with the fury of a wounded animal. Margaret woke to a sensation she remembered from her previous pregnancies, the deep, rhythmic tightening that announced her child's imminent arrival. Outside, snow driven by 60-mile-per-hour winds battered the ranch house windows, and she could hear the timbers groaning under the assault of what the old-timers called a widow-maker, a spring blizzard that could kill anyone foolish enough to venture into its embrace. "Silas," she whispered, touching his shoulder gently. He woke instantly, the alertness of a man accustomed to emergencies. "What is it?" "The baby's coming." For a moment, Silas lay perfectly still, as if the words hadn't quite registered. Then he was up and moving with swift efficiency, pulling on clothes and boots while firing questions at her. "How long have you been having pains? How far apart are they? Should I ride for Dr. Morrison?" Margaret gripped the bedpost as another contraction rolled through her, stronger than the first. "The storm, Silas. Listen to that wind. No one could make it to town in this weather, and even if they could, Dr. Morrison would never be able to get back here." The reality hit them both simultaneously. They were alone on the ranch with Mrs. Chen and the girls, facing the most dangerous and miraculous event in human experience, with no medical help, no experienced midwife, nothing but their own courage, and whatever knowledge they could piece together from remembered conversations and half-understood advice. "Mrs. Chen," Silas called, his voice carrying clearly through the house despite the storm's howling. "Mrs. Chen, we need you." The housekeeper appeared within minutes, already dressed and carrying an armload of clean linens. Margaret realized the older woman had been preparing for this possibility, understanding better than anyone how frontier births often unfolded without professional assistance. "How close are the pains?" Mrs. Chen asked, her calm demeanor providing anchor in the chaos of the moment. "Maybe 10 minutes apart," Margaret gasped, feeling another wave building. "But they're getting stronger quickly." Mrs. Chen nodded grimly. "First babies often take their time, but this one seems eager to meet the world. Mr. Crawford, I'll need you to help me prepare the room. Boil water, gather all the clean sheets and towels you can find, and make sure the fire stays strong. This room needs to be warm when the baby arrives." Silas hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Margaret's side. She could see the fear in his grey eyes, the shadow of old trauma threatening to overwhelm him. "Go," she said firmly, gripping his hand. "I need you to be strong right now. We can do this together." The next several hours blurred into a haze of increasing pain and desperate improvisation. Mrs. Chen proved to have more knowledge of childbirth than Margaret had dared hope, while Silas transformed into an efficient assistant, following orders without question while keeping the fire fed and the room stocked with everything they might need. "Emma and Sarah?" Margaret asked, during a brief lull between contractions. "Still sleeping," Silas replied, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. The storm will keep them from hearing anything. They'll wake up to a new brother or sister. But as the morning wore on, it became clear that this birth would not be the straightforward delivery they'd hoped for. The contractions grew stronger but seemed to accomplish little, and Margaret found herself exhausted from hours of unproductive labor. Mrs. Chen's expression grew increasingly worried as she monitored the baby's position. "Something's not right," the older woman finally admitted, her voice low enough that only Silas could hear. "The baby's not positioned properly. It's trying to come, but—" "What does that mean?" Silas's voice was tight with controlled panic. "It means we need to help it along, or we could lose both mother and child." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Margaret saw his face go white, saw the tremor in his hands as he gripped the bedpost. This was his worst nightmare, manifesting the possibility of losing another child, and this time taking the woman he'd grown to love with it. "Silas." Margaret's voice was weak but determined. "Look at me." He turned, his grey eyes wide with terror. "I need you to listen carefully. If it comes down to a choice between saving me or saving the baby, you choose. Don't." His voice was harsh, desperate. "Don't ask me to make that choice. I'm not asking. I'm telling you, Emma and Sarah need their mother more than they need a sibling. Promise me. Margaret, please. Promise me." Mrs. Chen intervened before Silas could respond, her voice cutting through their desperate exchange. "We're not there yet. There are things we can try. Miss Crawford, I need you to help me turn the baby. It's going to be difficult, and Mrs. Crawford is going to be in considerable pain, but it's our best chance." What followed was the most harrowing hour of Margaret's life. With Mrs. Chen guiding his hands and calling out instructions, Silas worked to manually reposition their child, his face etched with concentration and terror as Margaret's screams echoed through the room. The storm outside seemed to respond to her cries, wind and snow battering the windows with increased fury, as if nature itself was participating in this life-and-death struggle. "There," Mrs. Chen's voice carried triumph and relief. "I can feel the head now. The baby's in position. Mrs. Crawford, with the next contraction, you need to push with everything you have." Margaret gathered what remained of her strength, drawing on reserves she didn't know she possessed. She thought of Emma and Sarah sleeping peacefully down the hall, trusting that their mother would survive this ordeal. She thought of Thomas, who would have wanted her to fight for this new life. Most of all, she thought of Silas, whose desperate love and need had brought them to this moment. The contraction built like a wave, and Margaret pushed with every fiber of her being, feeling something give way, sensing movement and progress for the first time in hours. Mrs. Chen's encouraging voice guided her through the pain, while Silas held her hand with crushing strength, his own breathing as labored as hers. "Again," Mrs. Chen commanded. "The head is almost clear. One more push like that." Margaret bore down again, and suddenly she felt the rush of release as their child slipped free into the world. For a moment, the room fell silent, except for the storm's continued howling. Then, cutting through the wind's roar, came the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard, the lusty cry of a newborn taking its first breath. "It's a boy," Mrs. Chen announced, her voice thick with emotion. "A healthy, perfect boy." Silas stood frozen, staring at the squirming, red-faced infant in Mrs. Chen's capable hands. Margaret watched her husband's face transform as the reality hit him. He had a son, alive and breathing, and demanding attention with impressive volume. "Let me see him," Margaret whispered, exhaustion and joy warring in her voice. Mrs. Chen cleaned the baby quickly and wrapped him in the soft quilt Margaret had embroidered during the long winter months. When she placed the child in Margaret's arms, the world seemed to stop spinning. This was their sonnet, a replacement for James, not the fulfillment of a business arrangement, but a unique individual with his own personality, already asserting itself through vigorous protests at being thrust into the cold world. "He's beautiful," Margaret breathed, studying the tiny face that bore hints of both his parents' features. Silas approached slowly, as if afraid the scene might disappear if he moved too quickly. When Margaret offered him the bundle, his hands shook so badly she worried he might drop their precious cargo. "I'm afraid," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Of what?" "Of holding him too tightly, of needing him too much, of failing him the way I failed, James." Margaret reached up to touch his weathered cheek, seeing the vulnerable man beneath the successful rancher's facade. "You didn't fail, James, and you won't fail this one. Just love him, Silas. That's all any child needs." As if responding to his father's voice, the baby's cries quieted, and he opened dark eyes that seemed to look directly at the man holding him. In that moment, Margaret saw something beautiful happen. She watched Silas fall in love, not with his dead son's replacement, but with this specific child, this new person who would write his own story across the years to come. The baby's first cry pierced the storm-darkened room like a declaration of victory, and Margaret felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what she and Silas had built together. This wasn't just the fulfillment of their practical arrangement, this was the birth of their family, complete and genuine in ways she'd never expected when she'd accepted his shocking proposal 9 months earlier. "Thomas James Crawford," Silas whispered, his voice breaking as he cradled his son against his chest. The name they'd chosen felt perfect now, honoring the past while embracing the future. "Welcome to the world, little man." Mrs. Chen worked efficiently around them, cleaning up the evidence of their struggle while the storm continued its assault on the house. Margaret lay exhausted but triumphant, watching her husband discover fatherhood with wonder that made her heart ache. This was so different from his desperate planning and anxious hovering. This was pure, uncomplicated love for the child in his arms. "He has your stubborn chin," Margaret observed, smiling despite her exhaustion. "And your determination," Silas replied, his thumb stroking the baby's tiny fist. "Listen to those lungs. He's not afraid to make his needs known." The sound of running feet in the hallway announced the arrival of Emma and Sarah, who burst through the door with eyes wide at the scene before them. They'd been awakened by the baby's cries, but instead of fear, their faces showed pure excitement. "Is that our brother?" Emma asked, approaching the bed with 8-year-old dignity. "He's so small," Sarah exclaimed, bouncing on her toes to get a better view. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the girls' easy acceptance of their new sibling. They'd worried about how Emma and Sarah would adjust to sharing their mother's attention, but both children seemed genuinely delighted by the baby's arrival. "Would you like to hold him?" Silas asked Emma, his voice gentle despite his own emotional overwhelm. Emma nodded solemnly, settling into the chair beside Margaret's bed, while Silas carefully transferred the baby to her arms. The sight of her eldest daughter cradling her newborn son filled Margaret with a peace she hadn't felt since Thomas's death. This was what family looked like, not the desperate arrangement she'd entered into, but the organic love that had grown from their practical beginning. "What's his name?" Sarah asked, stroking the baby's dark hair with one careful finger. "Thomas James," Margaret replied. "Thomas for your papa, and James for—" She paused, looking at Silas. "For a little boy who would have been his big brother," Silas finished quietly, "someone who would have loved him very much." The explanation was simple enough for the girls to understand, but Margaret heard the deeper meaning. Silas was choosing to include James in their family story, not as a ghost to be replaced, but as a beloved brother who had simply arrived earlier than expected. It was a profound shift from the desperate replacement fantasy that had originally driven their arrangement. As the day wore on and the storm finally began to subside, Dr. Morrison arrived with the county sheriff and 2 other men who'd braved the remaining winds to check on the isolated ranch. The doctor's examination confirmed what they already knew: mother and baby were both healthy, despite the challenging circumstances of the birth. "You did everything right," Dr. Morrison told Mrs. Chen, though his eyes included Silas in the praise. "Frontier births are always risky, but this one couldn't have gone better. The baby's strong, Mrs. Crawford is recovering well, and that's a blessing given the conditions." That evening, As the house settled into quiet contentment, Margaret found herself alone with Silas and their son. The baby nursed hungrily, his tiny hands kneading her breast with instinctive purpose, while Silas sat beside them, his weathered face soft with wonder. "I never imagined it would feel like this," he said quietly. "What?" "Complete. For 15 years, I felt like half a man, like I'd failed at the most important job a person can have. But holding him, watching you with him, seeing Emma and Sarah accept him so naturally." Silas shook his head, unable to find adequate words. "You're not half a man, Silas. You never were. Losing James was a tragedy, but it didn't diminish you. It just made you human." "I love you," he said suddenly, the words emerging with startling clarity. "Not because you gave me a son, not because you fulfilled our arrangement, but because of who you are. Because you made me understand that grief doesn't disqualify someone from future happiness." Margaret looked at her husband, really looked at him, seeing past the practical rancher to the man who'd learned to love again, despite his fears. "I love you too," she replied, and knew with certainty that she meant it. "I didn't expect to, didn't plan to, but somehow you became more than just the man who saved us from poverty. You became the person I want to share my life with." The baby finished nursing and drifted off to sleep, his tiny face peaceful in the lamplight. Margaret watched Silas study their son with paternal pride that held no shadow of past loss, only present joy and future hopes. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I want to teach him everything, how to ride, how to work the land, how to be a good man. But mostly I want to watch him become whoever he's meant to be, not try to make him into someone else." "That's the difference between fatherhood and fantasy," Margaret said softly. "James would be proud of the man you've become." Silas was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the baby's back. "Do you think Thomas would approve? Of us, I mean, of how we found each other?" Margaret considered the question seriously. Thomas had been a practical man beneath his gentle exterior, someone who understood that love took many forms, and that sometimes the most important thing was simply caring for the people who depended on you. "I think Thomas would be grateful," she said finally. "Grateful that his daughters found security and love. Grateful that I found a partner worthy of trust and affection. He always said that life was too short and too difficult to waste time on pride or conventional expectations." "Then we're all blessed," Silas murmured, leaning over to kiss Margaret's forehead with tender reverence. "All of us, you, me, the girls, and this little one who had the courage to arrive during the worst storm of the season." As if responding to his father's words, Thomas James stirred in his sleep, one tiny fist unfurling to reveal perfect miniature fingers that would someday build and create and love in their own unique way. Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that comes from having navigated successfully through crisis to find solid ground on the other side. Outside, the storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and wind, but fundamentally unchanged in its essential character. Inside the Crawford Ranch house, 3 generations slept peacefully, Emma and Sarah in their comfortable beds, dreaming of the brother they'd help raise. Mrs. Chen in her room, satisfied with her role in bringing new life safely into the world. And in the master bedroom, a family that had found its way to genuine love through the most unlikely of paths. The arrangement that had begun with shocking practicality had evolved into something none of them could have predicted. Not just marriage, but partnership. Not just convenience, but commitment. Not just survival, but the kind of deep contentment that comes from choosing to love and be loved in return, whatever the original motivation might have been. 5 years later, Margaret stood on the wraparound porch of the Crawford Ranch house, watching her son take his first tentative steps toward his father. Thomas James, now a sturdy toddler with his mother's determined chin and his father's steady grey eyes, had finally found the courage to let go of the porch rail and venture into the open space between his parents. "Come on, Tommy," Silas encouraged, his arms outstretched and his weathered face bright with encouragement. "You can do it, son." The little boy took 3 wobbling steps before tumbling onto the soft grass, But instead of crying, he laughed with pure delight and immediately began the process of pulling himself upright again. Margaret smiled at the sight, remembering her own fears during those dark winter months when she'd worried that Silas's desperate need for a son might overshadow his capacity for simple paternal love. Those fears had proven groundless. Silas had become the kind of father Margaret had dreamed of for her children, patient, encouraging, present in ways that went far beyond mere provision. He taught Emma advanced horsemanship and helped Sarah with her reading, but he also built snow forts in January and told bedtime stories that made all three children beg for just one more chapter. "Mama, look!" Emma called from the corral, where she was working with the gentle mare Silas had given her for her 13th birthday. The girl had grown tall and confident over their years on the ranch, her dark hair now worn in a practical braid that spoke of a young woman who understood both work and responsibility. "I can take the jump without holding the saddle horn." "Beautiful form," Margaret called back, though her heart still caught every time one of her children attempted something that looked remotely dangerous. 5 years of prosperity and security hadn't quite erased the widow's instinct to protect against every possible loss. Sarah, now 11, and possessed of an artistic temperament that reminded Margaret of Thomas, sat under the oak tree, sketching the scene before her. She'd inherited her father's gentle nature, but combined it with a keen eye for beauty that found expression in her drawings and the songs she composed on the piano Silas had brought from Denver as a surprise. "Mrs. Crawford?" Mrs. Chen appeared at Margaret's elbow, carrying a fresh pitcher of lemonade. The housekeeper had aged gracefully over their years together, becoming less an employee than a beloved member of their extended family. "Mr. Henderson is here to see you and Mr. Crawford. Says it's important business." Margaret frowned slightly. Ben Henderson rarely made social calls, and his important business usually involved either community matters or problems requiring Silas's help. She walked over to where her husband was still encouraging Tommy's walking efforts, noting how naturally he'd transitioned from desperate would-be father to confident patriarch of their growing family. "Ben's here," she said quietly. "Mrs. Chen says it's important." Silas scooped up Tommy with easy affection, the little boy squealing with delight at being suddenly airborne. "Any idea what it's about?" "None, but he looked serious." They found Ben Henderson in the parlor, his hat in his hands and his expression troubled. Margaret had known the storekeeper for years, had watched him navigate the challenges of frontier commerce with practical wisdom, but she'd rarely seen him look so unsettled. "Ben," Silas said, settling into his chair with Tommy on his lap. "What brings you out this way?" "Silas, Margaret, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Word came in on yesterday's stage there's been a bank failure back east. The Territorial Development Bank in Cheyenne has called in all its loans, and that includes some significant debts held by folks in our community." Margaret felt a familiar chill of fear, the old dread that had once driven her to accept Silas's shocking proposal. "How significant?" "Significant enough that several families are going to lose their homesteads. The Petersons, the Williams family, young Jake Morrison, who just started that small spread north of town. They've got 30 days to come up with full payment or face foreclosure." Silas was quiet for a moment, bouncing Tommy absently while his mind worked through the implications. Margaret knew that expression her husband was calculating not just the financial impact, but the human cost of families being driven from their homes. "How much are we talking about, Ben? Total debt for all the affected families?" "Near as I can figure, about $12,000. More money than most folks around here see in a lifetime." Margaret's breath caught. $12,000 was indeed a staggering sum for a frontier community, but she also knew it was well within Silas's means. The ranch had prospered enormously over their 5-year marriage, expanded not just in acreage but in the diversified operations that had made them one of the most successful enterprises in 3 territories. "What are you thinking?" she asked her husband quietly. Silas looked at her with an expression that reminded her of why she'd fallen in love with him, not just his strength or security, but his fundamental decency, his inability to ignore suffering when he had the power to alleviate it. I'm thinking that this community supported us when we needed it. Reverend Mitchell married us without judgment, Dr. Morrison risked that storm to help with Tommy's birth. Even Ben here extended credit when times were lean. Seems to me that success means nothing if you don't use it to help others when they're facing the same struggles you once knew. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with pride for the man she'd married. You want to pay their debts? I want to give them the same chance someone once gave you, an opportunity to build something lasting, instead of losing everything to circumstances beyond their control. That afternoon, the Crawford Ranch became the center of a quiet miracle. Word spread quickly through the small community, and by evening, 7 families had gathered in the ranch house parlor to hear Silas's offer. He would pay their debts in full, with the understanding that they would repay him over 10 years, at terms far more generous than any bank would offer. Why? Jake Morrison asked, his young face showing the strain of someone who'd been facing the loss of everything he'd worked to build. Why would you do this for people who aren't even family? Silas looked around the room at the faces of his neighbors, people who'd shared in community celebrations, helped during emergencies, created the social fabric that made frontier life bearable. Tommy dozed in Margaret's arms, while Emma and Sarah listened from the doorway, absorbing lessons about generosity and community responsibility. 5 years ago, I made an arrangement that saved a widow and her children from losing everything, Silas said quietly. That arrangement became the foundation for the happiest years of my life. Maybe this is our chance to pass that blessing along, to help other families find the security and hope they need to build their own futures. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her husband offer hope to people facing the same desperation she'd once known. This was what their strange beginning had led to, not just personal happiness, but the kind of prosperity that created opportunities for entire communities. Later that evening, after their guests had left with expressions of gratitude and promises to honor the trust Silas had placed in them, Margaret found herself alone with her husband in the library where she'd first discovered the letter about James. The room had been transformed over the years, filled now with children's books, alongside agricultural journals, family photographs, alongside business documents. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" she asked, curled against Silas's side while he read the evening paper. "Different how? If you hadn't made that shocking proposal, if I'd been too proud to accept, if we'd never taken the chance on this strange arrangement." Silas set down his paper, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "I think about it sometimes. Wonder if I would have died alone in this big house, if your girls would have ended up in some orphanage back east, if Tommy would never have existed at all. Instead, we have this," Margaret said, gesturing toward the sounds of their children settling in for the night, Emma's voice reading to Sarah, Tommy's happy babbling as Mrs. Prubling's Chen prepared him for bed. "Instead, we have everything," Silas agreed. "A family built from the wreckage of old dreams, love that grew from practical soil, children who'll never know what it means to go hungry or feel unsafe." Margaret thought about the bank deed that now bore both their names, updated just last year to reflect their true partnership. The document that had once represented a desperate bargain had evolved into something far more meaningful, evidence of a marriage that had transcended its practical origins to become exactly what both of them had needed, even when they hadn't known what that was. "I love you," she said, the words as natural now as breathing. "I love you too," Silas replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "All of you, Emma, Sarah, Tommy, even the chaos and joy and constant noise of family life. I love the life we've built together." Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the sense of spring across their prosperous land, new grass, wildflowers, the promise of another successful season. Inside the ranch house that had once echoed with loneliness, the sounds of family life created a symphony of contentment that would have been impossible to imagine when a desperate rancher first made his shocking offer to a struggling widow. The wooden horse still sat on the library shelf, no longer a symbol of grief, but a reminder of how love could transform even the most practical arrangements into something miraculous. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to nurture the family they'd created and support the community that had embraced them. But tonight, Margaret Crawford fell asleep in her husband's arms, surrounded by the quiet breathing of children who would never doubt they were loved, in a house that had become everything a home should be, not through romance or passion, but through the daily choice to build something beautiful from whatever foundation life provided.